Hello, my name is Miss Hadi and I'm making this video for my classes at Olympian High School and also for Ms. Rogosin's classes, where we teach Ancient World History, which is a precursor to AP World History in the 10th grade. Let's get started with Chapter 11. We're going to be looking at the first 15 or 16 slides today. Now, we just finished Chapter 10, which was also about the Mediterranean society, except that chapter was about the Greeks. So this time we're going to look at the Roman phase. This is not in your slides at home, so just want to go over it really quickly, just some notes. This is roughly the same area as Chapter 10 with the Greeks, just later in time, and more so in what we think of as contemporary Italy. We know that the Mediterranean encompasses a large area, all the lands touching the Mediterranean Sea. But in the chapter on Greece, we were focused mostly on, the Greek area, what we think of as contemporary or modern-day Greece, and this time it's going to be Italy. It's similar, the Romans are going to be similar to the Phoenicians and Greeks in that they're also going to conquer new lands and stimulate trade, but a big difference is that ultimately the Romans are going to create an extensive land-based empire and centralized administration. They're also going to help spread a brand new religion that many of you are a part of, or have heard of, or have friends that participate in that religion, and that's Christianity, so it's very exciting. So just to be clear, when we talk about the Mediterranean, we're talking about this sea right here where the cursor is. So chapter 10 was about what we think of as modern-day Greece. Of course, it wasn't a country back then. Today we're going to be focused mostly on Italy, but as the Romans are going to move out and expand out of that region, they're going to move to other areas as well and conquer areas over here. So broadly, this whole area is called Europe, and of course down here is where Africa is. Now here you see Turkey. Sometimes Turkey is called Anatolia. That's the ancient name for it, so just keep that in mind. Another thing I want to do before we start is talk about some changes that you'll see. You're going to see this change from a monarchy to a republic to a sort of monarchy again, although it's more of a dictatorship at first. So I just want you to know that it's going to change over time, and these are different forms of government. So in the 8th century, which is the 700s BCE, Rome is a small city-state with a monarchy. So mono means one, so one person's in charge. And then we're going to see that shift to a republic in the 6th century, so that's the 500s. And they're going to expand quite a lot. So that means they're going to get larger, take over new lands. And that is going to lead to civil war because that new land is going to end up going to the hands of the wealthy, which aggravates the poor because it's going to increase social tensions. I'll talk about that later. That's between the 2nd and 1st centuries. Then we're going to see Julius Caesar becoming dictator. I'm not going to talk about that today. Ms. Rogosin's going to get into that. And then we'll see this period of time where there's a monarchy disguised as a republic. That's what it says in your book. And I'll have Ms. Rogosin send you a video to explain that. So just to give you a sense of what's happening, because it can be overwhelming. You see the governments change from one form to another, and we could be even more curious, and we could look up, okay, I want to know more about this. We could look up, timelines of all the wars. Uh-oh, this isn't what I wanted. Timeline of the wars, and look at, different, all the different wars. We're not going to go into depth here. I just want to show you that it is possible to go into more depth with all of these different wars. Now, of course, this is after the period that I'm talking about. I also want to talk about what it means to be a republic, but I'll come back to that. Okay, so let's continue with this next slide. Okay, so first of all, there are two possible stories you can believe when it comes to how Rome was created. One is a legend, so I would advise you not to trust that one unless you really like legends. And that's called the legend of Romulus and Remus. And Rome comes from the word Romulus, which is the name of the supposed person who was a twin. His brother's name was Remus. Apparently, the story goes that there's a man from Troy. Troy, of course, is in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor / Anatolia. The Greeks had attacked in the 700s. Remember, that was a time of turbulence when there were a lot of attacks going on in this region. Remember, like from that period, like 1200 to 800, a lot of conflict for the Greeks. Anyway, the Greeks attacked Troy. He migrated to Italy. He had twins there, Romulus and Remus, and according to the legend, there's an evil uncle who abandons them by the Tiber River where he thought for sure they would die of exposure, but they're saved by a she-wolf, and Romulus goes on to found the city of Rome in 753 BCE. The more historical story of how this city is formed comes from the Indo-European migrations, which we've been studying all the way back to chapter 2. So we've learned about other Indo-European migrants like the Persians and the Medes and the Aryans, all these different migrant groups that came to different regions. And Italy is the same. The population of Italy was originally Indo-European migrants. They come here around 2000 BC, so it's 2000 years before zero. They start to develop different metallurgies, bronze in 1800 and iron in 900 BCE. Here's a little Roman coin with Romulus and Remus, his brother Remus, on the other side. Okay, so there's a group of people that are in Rome that are going to dominate over the Roman city called the Etruscans. They're originally not from here. They're from Anatolia. As a reminder, Anatolia is here. It's what we think of as Turkey. If you want another picture of it, we're talking here. So again, here's Greece. And here's the region we're focused on today, what we think of as modern-day Italy. So they're from Anatolia, and they're going to come into this region. And they're going to colonize these Roman regions. They're going to bring with them bronze and iron goods, a tradition of gold and silver jewelry. And they're going to build this large fleet. And because of the location of, first they start off in the north of Italy, and they start to become very powerful in terms of trade. And of course, when you're trading, you're making money, you're making wealth, you're able to use those resources to finance a larger military and a more powerful state. Okay, so their society starts to decline in the late 6th century BC, so that's the 500s, partly because of Greek maritime invasions from outside and also Celtic invasions from the north near Gaul. So Gaul is like modern-day France. But they leave a long-term impact on Roman society. The Etruscans had monarchies, and many of the Roman kings of Rome were actually monarchs. So, were actually Etruscan. So they leave this, how do I put this? They leave a legacy of a monarchical government in place. Okay, so the Etruscans are there, but the Etruscans are eventually going to be displaced. That means someone else is going to take their place. And that someone else are the Romans themselves, who are going to take back over their area. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Kingdom of Rome was originally a monarchy through the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. There were paved streets, large temples, public buildings, defensive walls. And it was an important city because it wasn't right on the coast where it could easily be attacked. So there was less risk of invasion or attack, but because of the Tiber River, you could get to the coast. So again, that makes it really an important strategic site for trade, because you want to use the water to trade, but then it makes you less vulnerable for attack because you're not immediately on the coast. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Romans, I need to move this off to the side here. The Romans were ruled by the Etruscans, but eventually the Romans are going to depose the Etruscans, and ultimately they're going to change again. This era represents a change to an aristocratic republic. So just to be clear here, a republic is a form of government where delegates represent the interests of various constituencies. That's a lot to say. Basically, it's where people select or elect people to rule for them. A republic is not necessarily a direct democracy. So people in our country, in America, fight all the time about whether America is a republic or it's a democracy. Well, it's got elements of both. A democracy is where people have more voice in the decisions about what happens in the country. And in some ways, our country does have that. In other ways, we don't. We select people who make those decisions for us. So most people would probably argue that America is more of a republic. It's obviously not a direct democracy, or they might call it an indirect democracy. Anyway, you want to think of this as a republic. So people are selected to make decisions on your behalf. So not everyone has the full right to make participation. And especially at first, not the poor. Think of that. That's going to change over time. Now, I've been here. I've been to Rome. I've walked through this Roman, move this off to the side, through this Roman forum. They build this beautiful area where there are public buildings where the Roman government officials can come and carry on their duties. There's a Republican constitution. And then executive power is executed by two, what we call consuls, that have the military and the political power. Now, these consuls are people that have power for 1 year, and they're elected by an assembly of patricians. Patricians are the rich aristocratic classes, not to be confused with the plebeians, which are the lower classes. So there's two classes mostly. There's the plebeians and there's the patricians. Okay, so what we see at first is that the Roman government, once they get rid of or depose the Etruscans, is going to be serving the interests or the needs of the rich. There's also in the government something called a Senate. This is actually a continuity from Indo-European days. Supposedly, I don't know all the history of this, but the word Senate comes from the word senex, which means old man, because the Indo-Europeans, being tribal in those older days, they had clans, and the clans were advised by older men. And so this was an assembly of older men that had been around since way before, since they were first like a monarchy. And the power of the Senate is going to fluctuate. That means change over time. But most of the people who were in the Senate were aristocrats. They advised the consuls and they ratified decisions. Now, as I mentioned, there are two social classes, the patricians, which are the aristocrats or the rich, and the plebeians, which are the commoners. Sometimes we abbreviate this to, or shorten this to plebeians. So if you hear me say that, that's what I mean, the plebeians. So at first, both the Senate and the consul were mostly representing the interests of the patricians, and that's going to lead to social tension because the plebeians are going to feel like no one's listening to them. They're not able to have their voices heard. Things are not going to benefit them. And so there's major class conflict in the 5th century BCE when the plebeians threatened to secede and build their own separate settlement. In order to keep the plebeians from doing that, the patricians are going to compromise and allow them some more power. How do they do that? They give them something called tribunes, which is an office of someone who can fill that office as a tribune who can represent them. Now, originally there were only 2 tribunes. That's going to grow over time to 10. The tribunes could intervene in government and also veto decisions. And the rights of the plebeians are going to expand from the 3rd century onwards. So plebeians could eventually hold office and have one consul come from their classes. They could be part of assemblies with decision-making power. So what the book says that I want you to note is, thus, like 5th century Athens, Republican Rome gradually broadened the base of political participation. What does that mean? It means just like the Greeks before them that we learned in chapter 10, they also had a problem with social tensions because some people were rich, some people were poor. And so that's a similarity that I want you to just pay attention to. And broaden means widened, the base of political participation, the amount of people who can participate. Another thing that you need to know about Roman government is that if there was ever a military or political crisis, they would appoint a dictator, which is someone who had absolute authority or power to govern, for about 6 months. Now, the dictators weren't supposed to have power for more than 6 months, although they are in certain situations that Ms. Rogosin is going to tell you about. So anyway, these dictators are only supposed to have power if there's, for example, a social conflict, civil war, say. Okay, so Rome at first is a small city-state, and they have to deal with all kinds of outside pressures, external threats, like the Etruscans who still threaten them, and the Gauls, who are a Celtic group of people who threaten them. But eventually they're going to consolidate their position in central Italy. What does that mean, consolidate? Consolidate usually means 2 things. It either means consolidare, right, to unify, to solidify, or to strengthen. In this case, it means to strengthen. So they're strengthening their control over central Italy. They start to dominate over the Etruscans, and they took over the iron industry that was largely built by the Etruscans. And that's an important metallurgy industry. It's going to help them become stronger, strengthen their military, and then they'll expand. That means they'll get larger. They'll broaden the areas that they conquer outside of Italy. And beyond the central region first, and then outside of Italy. They do this 2 ways. One, through a powerful military force, and another reason is the way that they treat the people that they conquer. Rather than treating them like vanquished servants and really mistreating them, they give them an incentive to tolerate Roman rule. For example, they're sometimes exempt from taxes, Roman taxes. They have the right to trade in Rome, so trade privileges. They can even take Roman spouses, and they, for some people, have a pathway to citizenship to become a more dignified or respected member of society. Now, there are certain things they also have to do as a vanquished, subjected people. For example, not enter into military and political alliances with other states. And they also had to provide for military force, so they had to become soldiers in Roman armies. Now, as they expand their power, they flex their power outside of Italy. So if we look on the map, like here's Italy. This area in orange is at the time controlled by a power called Carthage, which is here. This little city controls it. Now, Sicily, this little ball that this boot is kicking, is a very grain-rich area, and the Romans want it. And the Carthaginians, because of their strategic location, had become very rich because of trade in the Mediterranean, and then used that money and those financial resources to become even more powerful. And so what we're going to start to see is this conflict with Carthage, these 3 major wars over Sicilian grain supply. And these together are called the Punic Wars. So when the Romans eventually do enter Carthage the 3rd time, they burn Carthage to the ground. They enslave over 50,000 people. So this is not like a nice confrontation. And however, now that they have all of the resources that Carthage has, all of the metallurgy that Carthage has, they now have the ability to build more powerful armies and continue even further imperial expansion. Well, where else could they expand? They could expand into the areas conquered by the Hellenistic empires that we learned about in chapter 10. Remember, the Hellenistic empires were the empires that formed after Alexander the Great died. And we know that there was the Antigonid Empire, and what we think of as basically Greece and Macedon, the Ptolemaic Empire, and what we think of as like basically Egypt, very rich, and the Seleucid Empire, which is in Persia. You also learned about it in the Persian chapter, chapter 7. Now, the problem is these empires, the Antigonid, Ptolemaic, and Seleucid, are weakening at the time. They're weaker, and they're not able to control pirates. Because they're not able to control pirates, what's happening is Roman citizens are starting to have encounters with pirates, and so the Romans feel like they have to protect their people, and that puts them into conflict with the supposed authorities of that area. And there's going to be over 5 wars with these different various Hellenistic empires. Eventually, Rome is going to dominate the Mediterranean by the middle of the 2nd century BCE. You can look at a map in your book. And every new area that they conquer, that's going to bring more wealth, more resources. And they're going to use that wealth to build powerful states and armies and continue expanding. Now, you might think imperial expansion sounds awesome. That's going to be really good for Rome, isn't it? Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, because it's going to exacerbate, that means make worse, exacerbate social tensions. See, between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, eventually Rome's going to change from a republic to a monarchy because of the problems with expansion. So when they expand, they conquer new lands. A lot of times that conquered land was given to the wealthy elites, the patricians, and those patricians built large plantations, which are large farms called latifundia, which benefit from something called economies of scale. That's an economic term you learn in 12th grade, but for now, let's just leave it to, let me make it very simple for you. If you make more of something, the price per item generally goes down. So if you have a large farm and you're making, let's just pretend, 1,000 carrots, your price per carrot is going to decrease. Versus if you're a small farmer, you can only make like 5 carrots. Each carrot is going to be more expensive to produce. So when the small farmer tries to sell his carrots, he has to sell them for more, and so people aren't going to buy his carrots. They're going to buy the cheaper carrot from the larger farmer, and unfortunately that's going to cause the smaller farmer to go out of business, sell his land, and either leave the countryside to go be like a poor urban resident, or become one of the landless rural people, peasants. So also the latifundia employed slave labor, which obviously they don't have to pay these people, so it's going to make it easier for them to produce, let's pretend carrots are not producing carrots, but just giving you an example. So they're going to outcompete these small farmers. So this is going to lead to land distribution problems, just like we've seen in other chapters where some people have land and other people don't. Now, this is a perennial problem, which means it keeps coming back over and over again. The development of large latifundia put unfair competition on the small landholders. As I said, the landholders have to sell their land, they become landless, and social tensions increase. So here you can see the Roman Empire by 146 BCE. It's going to get even bigger, but you can see that it's already gotten a lot larger. And remember, every time they take new land, this land is often going to the rich and not the poor, and fueling more social tensions. Okay, well, not everyone is happy with the fact that many people are starting to become completely poor and have no land. And some people want social reform. That means they want change. They want a change in society so that the poor are not landless. And 2 people whose names you have to remember are the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They're very similar to Wang Mang in the chapter that we learned about between the former Han and the later Han dynasty, who wanted to take land from the rich and redistribute it to the poor. Except instead of wanting to redistribute land, they wanted to limit the land holdings of aristocrats. They wanted to say, okay, you've already taken this much of the conquered land. You only get this much. You can't have more than that. And when he tried to do that, the rich elite patricians are going to eventually plot and have them assassinated. Okay, so at that point, their social tensions are increasing. Generals are going to jockey for power, and civil war is what we're going to see next, essentially. And so, to make matters worse, these generals that are fighting for power recruit for soldiers from the landless peasants that are all over the place, because nobody has land. They need some way of making money. They become soldiers. So they're either rural landless peasants or urban landless peasants. There are 2 major armies, one of Gaius Marius, who's really important. He's with the reformers, who wants things to change, and one of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who's an aristocrat. He doesn't want things to change. He's with the conservatives. Okay, so there's going to be a civil war. After the Gracchi brothers are killed, many fought for power, raised personal armies. I told you about that. In the year 87 BC, so 87 years before zero, Gaius Marius is going to march on Rome. He's the most important of the generals fighting for power. He's a social reformer. He's going to put Rome under military occupation and then kill his enemies, particularly people that like Sulla. Eventually, Sulla is going to, Gaius Marius is going to die, and Sulla is going to come into Rome. He's with the conservatives, aristocrats, so now this is the opposite perspective. This is let's keep everything the same. And he's going to go around instituting a reign of terror where he posts lists of prescribed enemies of the states and tells Roman citizens to kill these people on sight and confiscate their land. So for 5 years after Sulla takes power, like 10,000 people are killed, and the rights of the lower classes are severely weakened. So that broad base of political participation is going to diminish. And that is it for the day. We have this very chaotic situation. There's a civil war. There's people that don't have any land. What happens next is going to be Miss Rogosin's next video for you. Please stay tuned. We're going to see the most famous of the Roman rulers, Julius Caesar and Augustus, also called Octavian. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. And don't forget, you can always learn more. I think I mentioned to you that there are other sites that you can see where you can learn a little bit more about the Roman Republic.